Hey, everybody, welcome to Isolation Bible Study. I'm Bill Tucker with Zach McIntosh from Concordia. And as you can see on your screen, we've got a whole bunch of other folks. We started this last weekend, but we are doing the current sermon series called Reopening Christianity with a number of other congregations. And so, guys, why don't we just go around the horn real quickly and introduce yourselves. JJ, let's start with you.
Jeremy Jacoby. I'm senior pastor at Summit of Peace Church, and it's a suburb of Denver called Thornton, Colorado, and happy to be on with you guys again this morning.
Hey, Rob.
Yeah, Rob Goodwin. I'm a pastor at Our Saviors in Palm Springs, California. Just a joy to be here with you guys again.
Z.
Hey guys, Zach Zender from The Cross in Mount Dora, Florida, just outside of Orlando.
And of course, the other guy on the screen is Zach McIntosh. Zach, what's interesting today is that you and I are actually in the same room with this plexiglass thing between us for social distancing.
Yes, we are definitely practicing social distancing, and I see you through a glass dimly or something like that.
Wait a minute, are you saying I'm dim? Is that what you're trying to say?
No, not at all.
So this is the second week of our series called Reopening Christianity, and the topic for this weekend was, are you a contributor or are you a consumer? And the idea really was the concept that a contributor is someone who gives, and it's kind of motivated out of generosity. We give or we contribute without any expectation of receiving in exchange. A consumer, and we're a consumer in a lot of various parts of our lives, is someone who's involved in a transactional kind of a circumstance. So we give, but there's the expectation we're going to receive in return. And I thought maybe to just kind of get things started, let's talk about sort of the overall approach that you took to this message and series. Let's use that same order. Let's start with JJ and then Rob, then Zach Zender, and then back to Zach McIntosh.
So this topic is one that is really near and dear to our hearts at Summit. A number of years ago, we were reaching kind of a tipping point at our church where I thought we really needed to embrace and focus in on what God was calling us to do and to move away from a consumer mentality. And at an all church meeting that we had, I decided to write my own parable, and I decided to use the concept of the difference between a cruise ship and a rescue boat. And that our church in particular, and I think many churches in America, whether the people realize it or not, operate like they're on a cruise ship, that the staff, the people there are there to make sure they're comfortable, get them their drinks, get them a good seat by the pool, all that kind of stuff. And I made a big push. In fact, such a big one that eventually people started buying me things like this
that looks nice on you.
Yeah, it's really nice. It's high quality stuff. I feel a little bit like Gilligan's Island when I wear it, so I don't put on too much. But yeah, just moving to this concept of that we're part of a rescue boat, and as soon as you've been pulled onto the ship, we get you healthy again, get you through the infirmary, get you fed, strong again. But then you're part of the crew, and so this is that's kind of language we used, and so it was a big part of how we think about it, and it just was exactly what our theme was, talking about being a consumer or contributor yesterday.
That's awesome, Jeremy. That's a great way to see that in real easy imagery for us to all hold in our minds. Rob, talk to us about your approach.
Yeah, my approach was a little bit different. I mean, I've always sort of seen this idea of consumerism and this contribution mindset as sort of the difference between being a member, which looks at things in terms of, as a member, I'm entitled to things, versus a disciple who God calls us to be, who is actually a disciple who produces and actually produces for the kingdom of God. So that was a sort of focus I took, which was, what is the difference between members and what is the difference of how a disciple acts? And sort of talked about the goals of each, that a goal of a member is to get people to join, whereas the goal of a disciple is to get people to increase in their love for God and their neighbor. And then what is the church's role in that? And the church's role as a member is just to keep members and keep them satisfied. And so many churches, I think, focus on just that aspect, whereas really the church's role when we talk about making disciples is about fostering spiritual growth. And so that was sort of the sort of thing I played on the whole time, was this idea of member versus disciple. And members tend to be people who just consume, whereas disciples are people that actually produce and contribute.
Yeah, that's awesome. So we see the overlap, right?
Yeah.
It's connected, but taking a slightly different approach. Now, Jeremy and Rob, you were in the same text that we were in terms of Acts chapter 9, the story of Tabitha or Dorcas.
Yeah.
Zach, I think you were doing a different text this weekend, weren't you?
Yes, I used several texts, but probably the primary one when we talk about contributing is looking at Jesus and how he contributed with the woman at the well in John chapter 4. So kind of a very well-known story, but some very little-known verses in it. And John 4:34 is kind of the key text when Jesus said, "My food is," because the disciples came back after they had eaten and they'd seen Jesus, he hadn't eaten yet. And so they, but Jesus said, "Oh, no, don't worry, I have food." And they were like, "What? You got Chick-fil-A on a Sunday? How did you do that, Jesus? That's crazy." And anyway, Jesus said, "My food is to do the will of the Father who sent me." And so I really like that verse as a springboard, because I think it is so different from our natural self-centered, self-aware state that we can get in, where we think to fill up, we need to just keep eating and keep consuming. And there's just a lot of people I know that have consumed a lot and they've put in a lot, and they're still empty. And that's where Jesus flips it and said, actually, I get more filled up when I contribute. My food, I get full when I do what God sent me to do. And so that's really where I took it, and really to try to help people see that, because we live in a day of age where a lot of people lack purpose and don't find fulfillment. And for me, it was matching that with contributing. That probably the reason some of you, it's not an eating problem. We don't have a consumption problem in this country, most of us. It's a contribution problem. And so if you've been eating all that and you're still hungry, try serving. And so anyway, that was a big piece of it. I think from a church standpoint, it's interesting. A lot of times we'll talk about, hey, the church needs you for this. The church needs you for this. We have this area over here we need people to serve. This area here we need people to jump into. And I think that's fine. Like, that'll happen here and there. But what I really try to do is flip it and say, actually, no, you need this. You need fulfillment and you need purpose. And I think the church is the place to offer great fulfillment, because we get to do the will of the Father together.
Very cool. Zach, I loved what you were talking about when you were talking about identity, because one of the things we hit on this weekend was the fact that if you really want to know who you are, if you want to be true to yourself, you've got to be a contributor, because you don't find yourself in consuming, you find yourself in contributing, and discover how God has gifted you and how he's blessed you. Zach, you didn't preach this weekend, but you did ABC. And so what'd you do with this Acts chapter 9 text?
So there were a couple of things that you and I kind of overlapped on in both the message and in Bible class. And one was very simply that contributing is a really good way to build bridges. One of the things that we both mentioned was that Tabitha has two different names. And so we were in Acts 9, and her Hebrew name is Tabitha. Her Greek name is Dorcas, which meant that Tabitha not only contributed to people who were like her, she contributed to people who were unlike her. And so she was literally contributing in a way that brought down racial barriers, which, that seems slightly relevant in our particular context. But then the other thing, and Zach, this kind of goes to what you were saying, consuming can make you feel good for a second, but contributing is just part of human dignity. I think a lot of people have been in conversations where somebody wants to do something nice for somebody else or for you, and your kind of first reaction is, no, you don't have to do that. But then you can tell the further the conversation goes, if you say no to them, you're actually in some sense offending them, because they want to be able to do something nice for you. And so one of the best things you can do is just receive that with a little bit of grace, because that's part of who we are as humans. And if we refuse to contribute, if we live our whole lives as consumers, not only is it bad for the world because we're being selfish, it's actually bad for us because it strips us of our identity and it just leaves us empty.
Yeah, love it, Zach. Love it. So, Jeremy, coming back to you. So, of the message that you delivered, what were the things you were hoping people would take away? What was kind of the key that you wanted them to walk away with?
Yeah, so I shared this with you guys last week that going into this week, I was having my own challenge in thinking about this topic, because if you would have asked me before we went into isolation and adjusted to all this, I'd have this huge list of things that I thought meant you contributed to our church. But when we had to adjust how we operate as a church, and no one could do those things anymore, it made me really kind of question how much of our service is about us. And that is not to say that those things aren't valuable. I want to try to be really clear about that yesterday. But there is a difference between serving us, serving internally, and serving the world, right? And in fact, so I added one text to our talk that hardly, I mean, I don't know if I've ever preached it before, although I use it as a metaphor for our church body. It's called the parable of the two sons, right? Where the father asks the one son to go and work, and he says yes and doesn't, and the one who says no but then goes and does. And I don't know about you guys, but I serve a church where I think for a long time we struggled with as long as you said the right thing, then you were being a contributor. And I just don't think that while saying the right thing is good, right, and salutary, God calls us to go beyond that, right? And so I really wanted them to leave with the idea that even if it's difficult, right, how we served over these last 3 months was perhaps greater than we had done in years and years as a church as a whole.
That's cool.
Yeah, terrific. We had kind of the similar emphasis at one point. Rob, what about you? What were you hoping folks would take away or put into action?
I sort of had a similar emphasis as Jeremy did, but at one point I know I asked a very difficult question for our congregation to answer, and what struck me in the Tabitha story was the fact that when she had passed away and died, that the people she was serving were crying and really were missing her and missing her because of what she had been serving and doing with them. And the question I asked yesterday was, has Palm Springs actually cried for us while our building has been closed? Because I actually believe that there's so much more that we could be doing within our community, especially because of the group that we're called to reach and to share God's love with. We have been placed on the corner, we believe, right on Ramon Road there in a key location for Palm Springs to reach out to the LGBTQ community. And, it became very clear to me as I read the story from Acts 9 and thought about our saviors that I really believe that probably no one wept because we probably haven't been serving the way that we need to serve in our community.
Wow, that is a tough question.
Yeah.
It kind of goes with a question that I've heard before, and that is if our church just disappeared, right?
Yeah.
Would the community ever even notice? So it's the same idea, really powerful introspection there.
Yes.
Awesome. Zach, what about you? Where did you kind of land and want people to take off from?
Yeah, certainly with the overall idea that in the new phase of Christianity, the new brand, where we hopefully get to be the greatest and fullest expression of who Jesus is, that we need them and we want them. And not only that, but they need us too. So this sort of partnership of how we can work together. I think this week for me, obviously the sermon series is 5 weeks. This week and next week almost feels like a 2-part sermon to me. So for me this week, it was a little bit more imaginative and let's say setting the picture for what I hope happens next week, to where we can get a little bit more practical. So for this week, I really wanted to set the stage of the main idea of contributing and why it's good for everybody. As the theologian Michael Scott in The Office says, it's a win-win-win, right? The church wins because we get great servants. You win because you find fulfillment, in the communities in which we serve win because the love of Christ comes to them. So it's awesome everywhere. That was kind of my main thing this week, is just imagine with me if everyone did their part, we could be the full expression of Jesus. And then I think next week is really, and I'm not saying we need to go there yet, but as we talk about playing offense and defense, I think next week is going to be a little bit more specific than to how do you contribute. So how do you play offense, which I do think contribution is that. How do you play offense well? And so for me next week, it's going to be lying a little bit more of the groundwork between what it looks like to actually use my gifts, because God has given every person a gift. And so I think we're going to get more practical next week. This week was just kind of the, hey, imagine with me and let's set the stage of why this is important.
Yeah, terrific. And we'll get to next week here in just a minute. Zach McIntosh, as Zach Zender was talking about this, I was thinking about the one part that we discussed, at least in the message, and I'm not sure in ABC if you covered this or not, but when we're using our gifts, one of the ways that we know that we're gifted in that particular way is that the people that we're serving are blessed, but we're blessed by virtue of that service. It's the win-win-win, right? That he just mentioned. What were you hoping in ABC that people were going to take away from that time together?
Well, kind of my bottom line was I wanted to make sure that every single person knew that, especially because everybody's feeling worn out and they're feeling empty, I wanted to make sure that everyone knew that they still had something to contribute, mainly because they have been contributed to. And so one of the things that I teased out in the Tabitha story is there's this kind of chain of contribution. You can kind of trace it back and trace it through. And I'm kind of a language geek, so I did it with a little bit of language.
What kind of a language geek?
I'm a complete language geek, so I did it with a little bit of language. So you have Tabitha, and she's this amazing contributor. But then in the middle of the story, her contribution kind of ends because she dies. And you made the point of the message, even when your life ends, you can still be a contributor. But she's able to get a new lease on life because somebody contributes to her. Peter comes and he raises her from the dead. And this is kind of my language geekiness. So he comes to her and he has this little saying, and it's very simple, where he says to her in Acts 9, verse 40, Tabitha, get up. And Peter is a fisherman, grew up as, in the Jewish culture. And so in Aramaic, which is what he would have been speaking, it would have been very simple. Tabitha, cum. That would have been what he said. And so I kind of went back to Mark 5, where there's this really interesting little story where there's the synagogue ruler. His name is Jairus, and he has a girl who dies. And Jesus comes. And who's with Jesus? But actually Peter, James, and John. And so Peter sees this whole thing. And what does Jesus say to this little girl? Because he says she's just sleeping, and everybody laughs at him because they're not scientifically enlightened. They know when somebody's not breathing. They know when somebody doesn't have a heartbeat. She's clearly dead. But Jesus goes to this little girl, and he says to her, Mark 5, verse 41, Talitha cum. And so there's this chain of contribution. Tabitha contributes because she's contributed to by Peter. But the only way that Peter knows how to do any of this is because he's been contributed to by Jesus. He just takes the words and passes them down. And so that's really who we're called to be as the people of God. Jesus contributes to us. We just take what he's given us and we just pass it down and pass it around. We always have something to contribute as long as we have Jesus. So language geekiness there.
Yeah, for a language geek, that's a pretty good point. I like it.
I love it.
One of the final point that we had in the message this weekend was the whole idea. We were talking about collaboration and that we can contribute collaboratively, that we actually see exponential improvement, growth, help, whatever it is, when we add our gifts and talents to what other people are doing. And I love a quote from Tom Zelt. Tom is a brother pastor up in Fremont, California. And in a message that he was preaching recently, he said these words: "Don't think that your lifetime limits what God can do through you." In other words, we don't just contribute to the people who are around us that we can see that are living contemporarily with us, but literally we're building on the contributions of people before us, and we have the ability to lay a foundation so that people can build on our contributions. And I love that idea that what we're doing is not only multiplying by virtue of collaboration within our church family and our multiple churches, kind of exactly what we're doing here in our congregations, but that continues on for generations after. And so that's kind of a fun point in borrowing from another brother pastor. So guys, let's transition just a little bit then. So we're going to move on into next week. And the question, and by the way, these are all tough questions. I keep telling the congregation up front, brace yourself, right? These are questions that really should bring out, Rob, as you mentioned, the introspection. That's really hard things to think about and ask. So the question this weekend is, are you on offense or defense? And I believe, so we're all using the story of David and Goliath for that text this weekend. Well, that'll be fun next Monday. We'll all have been in the same place, pretty close at least. So Jeremy, one more time around here, what are you thinking about? What's rattling around in your heart and mind on this question? Are you on offense? Are you playing offense or playing defense?
Yeah, so it's actually the perfect transition of what you're talking about. It's a little bit what Zach Zender had said about connecting it with last week, right? So the thing that I found over the years with the David and Goliath story, and one of the approaches I'm going to take is that, I mean, it is an amazing story about God being with this young boy, right, and overcoming this amazing thing. But the subtext that I think we a lot of times forget is actually David goes into it with confidence because of everything that has happened to him in the past, all the ways that God has been with him. He doesn't approach this as like a first time type of thing. The trials and tribulations, the things he's seen as a shepherd have actually led him to have the skills and the confidence to trust God going into it. And that I believe this is something that we're supposed to take out of the last 3 months that we've had, right? As we look and desire to go back to normal, there's some things that I think we should leave behind, but there's some things we should take with us. And one of those are God has used this time to shape all of us, to work on all of us. Maybe it's removing some things, breaking some idols from us. Maybe it's revealing areas of hurt that we need to continue to confess. But also he's shown us his promises, the way he keeps them, the way that he has seen us through it and used us to help other people as well. And so I'm looking to sort of make it really concrete, right? From what we talked about last week into this week.
Very cool. Very cool. I can't wait to hear how that all lands. Rob, what about you? Where are you going with this text and with this question?
Yeah, I'm still sort of wrestling with it a little bit, but I mean, I think the big place I'm at with this is this idea of really offense versus defense. And I believe that because of the culture that Palm Springs is and the culture that we see around us today, that it's easy for a Christian to sort of sit back and play defense and sort of sit back and really not want to step out into the public square. And so I'm actually leaning towards the idea of if we look at Goliath and what happened here with David, even though it seemed like that everything was against him and that there was not going to be something that was going to be positive, that's sort of what everybody was thinking about around David at the time, but that he stepped out even into that battle and actually relied on what God gave him to actually be successful. And so I think our people need to hear the same thing, that yes, we look at our community, we look at our world, and we see that sometimes Christianity is being pushed to the side. And because of that, we don't want to step out on offense. And I believe we're called actually to step out in offense and use God's word as the tool that we use to proclaim Jesus and get that out there more than ever. So that's sort of the position I'm at right now. And I'm still wrestling with it, but I think this idea of really not being afraid to step out and share what we know is really a key piece of this.
You know, Jeremy said a few minutes ago when we were talking about the question, am I a contributor or am I a consumer, that he really had to struggle with that himself, that it was really kind of an introspective question. And I love what you said at the beginning of your comments there, Rob, that you're still struggling with the text and which way to go. You know, I find that when somebody tells me, boy, that was a great message, Pastor, or that was really helpful to me, or something like that, there are two things that I know have probably happened, right? One is that the Holy Spirit took whatever I did and made it worthwhile. Right. But the other thing that I know is if it really did kind of speak to people, chances are I had to really struggle my way through, because it was convicting. It was something that was of significance that I needed to grow in my own life. And so I love when you talked about struggling through, because I think we're probably all at that stage right now. Zach, what are you thinking about for this weekend?
Yeah, to me, this is my favorite of the 5 questions, and it's got that big biblical story too. And I'm passing it off to my associate to preach. That's the kind of guy that I am. No, but I love this question. I think defense is boring. I think offense is so much more fun. And after how good God's been to us, like my, life goal is to not sit back, but to just do what I can and play my part, knowing that it's not me, but God's power in me. It was the same way with David. But a couple of things that I've talked with him about that we'll see what comes in the message is David's unique style of fighting is important to me, because I think this is where giftings come in, that not every one of us has every gift, but every one of us has a gift. And Goliath scared people because he was a champion prize fighter. And if anyone would have battled with swords with Goliath, they would have lost. But David didn't go in with swords. He went in with a sling, and 5 stones, only needed one of those stones, because he was a marksman. He was a slinger. And so that was his offense. He knew how he was gifted. And so once he brought those, I think the narrative has to flip, that he's no longer the underdog. He's actually, especially with God on his side, he never was. But going into that, he's not the underdog, because Goliath's never going to touch him. So I just like that part of contributing and playing offense is knowing how you're gifted. And then the second piece I just love is the gospel in this, that David, of course, is a type of Christ. Certainly not perfect, but represents him. And I love the story that even though he didn't fight him with a sword, he used the enemy's weapon to destroy and eventually cut the head of Goliath off. And that's what I see Jesus doing with the cross. It was a torture instrument meant to kill, and the thing that was meant to destroy ended up being the thing that delivered us. And so even when the enemy throws weapons at us that make us want to force us into defense, we get to take those same weapons, and our strongest offense comes when we take what he throws against us and use it for our God. So I wish I was preaching. Anyone? Yeah, you guys got an opening this Sunday? Anyone?
Dude, I can't believe you gave up David and Goliath. That's what a generous guy you are. Hey, Zach Zender, so it was your idea in the beginning for us to do this series collaboratively. You threw it out there and sort of created the outline and the first steps toward this. So when you first posed the question of offense and defense, for just a minute, will you clarify what your thought was, kind of very specifically?
Yeah. It's just simply this idea that we can't sit back and let status quo be. Kind of the whole overarching goal of the series is we need a new brand of Christianity, because what we were known for prior to coronavirus is not the same things that Jesus was known for. And we've played too defensive. Like, this message, this gospel is way too good for us to sit silent. And God's put the Holy Spirit, like, he's equipped us. It's not like, we have this great thing and we can't do it. No, he's given us this great thing. He's given us his grace, and he's put his Holy Spirit in us. And so, like, let's just see what God can do. Again, knowing it's fully him in us, but like, he does use us. And so he's given you a gift. He's given me a gift. Let's find out these gifts. Let's conquer the enemy. And even when the enemy comes at us, like, no worries, man. The more you throw at me, the more destruction will come your way, because my God is strong, and nothing can be against us if God is for us.
Awesome. So Zach McIntosh, you've got all of 45 seconds. That's impossible for you, right? What are you thinking about for this weekend?
So one of the things that I think keeps us from going on offense is that a lot of people are scared, and people either just kind of cower in the corner and they play defense where they're not even holding ground, they're losing ground. Or they, instead of going on offense, they just decide to become offensive, which is not helpful at all. And so kind of one of my big points, there's this really interesting line in the story in verse 9 of the story where Goliath offers this challenge, and he says, hey, if anybody's able to fight and kill me, we'll become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you'll become our subjects. And so there's this representational fighting where, like, if one person wins the battle, that win is basically a win for the whole nation. If one person loses the battle, that loss is a loss for the whole nation. And so that's Jesus. Jesus is the one person, right, who fights the battle, and his win is our win. And so here's kind of my takeaway. We can be on offense, not for Jesus. Jesus doesn't need us to somehow, raise a sword for him, but we can be on offense because of Jesus. He's won the battle, so we don't have to be afraid. And that also changes the way we're on offense. We do that with love instead of with hatred or anger or bitterness or resentment.
Awesome. You know, I hope that you enjoy this study. Those of you who are listening in and part of this, I got to tell you, for me, it's awesome to hear all of the different perspectives and the different angles and takes on the topics that we're talking about. We're going to be back again next week, and we'll talk about David and Goliath and see where in the world these messages actually went. But folks, thanks for joining us for the Isolation Bible Study. God bless you. Have a great, great Monday.
Bless everyone.
Bye, guys.